Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for our next installment of Lindsey Byrd in Writing is Hard. Today, our topic of discussion focuses mainly on chronic illness, both writing it effectively and writing with it. While some parts of this discussion may feel uncomfortable for some members of the audience, I hope that it can provide a lot of clarity and insight for those who are curious and able to engage with this subject. I hope you enjoy. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today's interview is with Eshani Surya. Eshani is a 2022 Asian Women Writers Workshop mentee, a 2022 Kenyan Review Writers Workshop Scholarship recipient, a 2021 May Fellowship recipient, and a 2021 semifinalist for Key West Literary Seminar's Marianne Russo Award for Novel in Progress. Her debut novel, Ravishing, is out on the 11th of November, 2025, and it's a provocative, darkly surreal novel of two Indian American siblings caught in the clutches of a beauty tech company. Ravishing is a searing portrait of the beauty industry's dangerous ability to change people's relationship to their bodies and the cult-like grip it has on youth. Its back of book blurb reads, "For teenage Kashmira, it's painful to look at the mirror. She has her father's face, and every feature is a reminder of his abandonment. When a friend introduces her to a Voir, a beauty product that changes users' features, Kashmira is quickly hooked on how it allows her to erase the triggers of her grief. Meanwhile, at Volvoire's corporate offices, Kashmira's estranged brother, Nickel, first sees the product as an opportunity to make a difference and a name for himself, but is quickly mired in corporate complicity as reports surface of the product causing severe pain and persistent symptoms in some users. As chaos ensues, Kashmira is hospitalized and must negotiate the constraints of her new reality, while Nickel uncovers a vicious truth that will force him to decide where his loyalties lie. So, before we get into the meat and bones of this discussion, what inspired you to write this book?
Yeah, so I've always been really interested in the ways in which beauty operate. Growing up South Asian in a predominantly white town in the 90s, I didn't have a lot of people who looked like me around me, and I had a lot of insecurity about my skin color and my own face. And then as I grew older, I was also diagnosed with a chronic illness. And so that completely changed my relationship with my body as well, and made me rethink beauty because you don't care as much, I think, about looking good when you don't feel good. But then sometimes you also do want to look good because you don't feel good. So that kind of tension can really exist there. So this is something that I think has been a long time in the making to write about beauty. And I really got into the project after my own hospitalization in 2019, in which I felt like I really wanted to write about what it was like to be diagnosed with a chronic illness and live with one. And so I think those two interests really merged together into this book.
There's so much complexity involved with that. And also, when you're writing from such a personal background, how much of yourself do you give to your characters when you're designing this type of setting, this world, this experience?
hmm Um, yeah, so I would say that in the beginning, in the really early drafts, a lot of Kashmira in particular was really easily traced back to my life. But I think one of the wonderful things about writing fiction is that the world can really change and the characters can really shift as you start to get into the heart of the plot and the relationships with the characters, and you grow and you revise. And I think it's useful actually to have some distance between yourself as the author and then the characters. Because what I found was that when I was writing, for example, Nick Hill's storyline, there's a piece of me in that character as well. I used to work in a tech industry, not a beauty tech industry. But he is still really different in a lot of ways than how I am. And so as he grew, the way that he interplayed with Kashmira also grew, which meant that she sort of had to change as a character too. So where we are now with this book, I think there's a lot of grains of truth of my own life in it, but the circumstances that these characters are going through, not only obviously with the magical beauty product, but also their relationship with their father, things like that, has really changed away from who I am.
I think it's important when authors are writing on personal matters like this that they do create some sort of distance because I think it's very easy to especially when the book comes out and you start hearing feedback from other people to internalize some of the comments. And so having a bit more distance is actually helpful throughout the entire process, so it's not feeling as personal.
Yes, I absolutely agree with that. I think that if you are setting out to write a memoir or creative nonfiction, there's a lot of like ethical parameters around that, both for yourself and the other people that you might be writing about. That's not actually my background. I do write some nonfiction, but I think that I would want to think a lot more about those ethical parameters if I was going to write a whole book and release
Yeah.
it into the world in this way. So fiction feels like a healthy space for me to be in, for myself and for those around me as well.
One of the core premises of your book that your blurb is talking about is the product itself creates this pain. How did you interact with that as far as like developing the idea for it, but also the repercussions of you've taken something to make yourself feel good, but now that thing is actually hurting you?
Hmm. Yeah, so I think this product has gone through a lot of iterations in my novel. It's very much the vehicle for figuring out what I wanted to talk about with chronic illness. And because of that, I had to figure out what I wanted to say about chronic illness, and then go back and maybe alter the product in some ways. And in the beginning stages, it was a product that there were actually like multiple little products that people would take and things like that. There's just been a lot of shifting with that. But I think that is a core question for the characters in the novel. When you're trying to do something that will ideally help you and make you feel better, and that's your goal, and then you discover that that's not actually what's happening. There's a lot of grief there too. So these characters, they start off with grief with their father, but the process of processing that grief also leads them into more grief. And one of the core themes in the novel, and I think the heart of the novel, is how they contend with that together as a community.
Grief is such a powerful emotion to really tap into, especially when we're looking at other avenues such as illness or desire for beauty or things of that nature, because it's such an internal process, but it's also a process that just leaches into everything. Every part of your life is now subsumed with grief because you get angry when you shouldn't have been angry because that grief is making you angry. You make choices because you are experiencing that grief. When you're designing a character who's having these emotional fluctuations, how do you handle the actual like creative process of making this character realistic in that sense? Because grief makes you so emotional.
Mm-hmm. I also did a lot of research into how CPTSD can manifest in people, how trauma can. Because I have my own experiences with it, and I've seen obviously how other people deal with it and manage it as well. But I wanted to just think broadly about just what kind of research is out there as well about this. And that helped me build these characters and their responses in a lot of ways as well. It felt like I was aggregating a lot of information and then putting that into my characters. Um, in terms also of maybe how to build something that's believable, which I think is maybe a part of your question as well. Um, I think it's really important to give a lot of the character's interior to our readers, because sometimes what I would even get in some of those early drafts was feedback about like Nick Hill's character is really angry. He's somebody who works through his grief in really angry ways. And people would kind of be like, it feels sometimes repetitive. But of course, that is also a piece of grief that we have these repetitive responses and we can't break out of them. And so giving him a little bit more interiority where he's even maybe aware of how repetitive he's being, but he can't break out of it. I think it lets the reader in a different way. And it acknowledges the reading experience and the frustration that the reader might also be feeling. And maybe decreases the distance between the reader and the character because we could approach him when we're reading as I don't understand him at all. He's such a annoying character. I don't want to read about him. Or we can approach him as he's frustrated, I'm frustrated, we're both frustrated, we're on the page frustrated together, and we're kind of getting through this together. So I think that lessening that distance makes it a more impactful reading experience.
It's also more empathetic too, where
Mhm.
you can sit there and be like, I understand why he feels this way. I feel it with him. Instead of this being
Yes.
like, oh dude, you're like freaking out here. Now you're like, no, you should be freaked out right now. I'm with you,
Yeah.
man.
Yeah, exactly.
Um, we've talked a little bit about it so far, but if you don't mind going into more detail, how has the working with the topic of a chronic illness, both as a writer who's experiencing chronic illness and working and creating a character who is now experiencing a chronic illness, how do you manage that balance?
Can you say more what you mean by balance
Yeah,
there?
sure. So like as you're writing this character, from the actual practical technical side of it, were there things that were making it more complicated for you to actually sit down and physically write it? And then when you're actually experiencing putting those details for the character herself, who's now experiencing or beginning to experience chronic illness, how do you put that in so that somebody who is reading can also understand what that actually feels like?
Hmm. Yeah, so from the perspective of somebody who is chronically ill and maybe can't always sit at the computer in the way that someone who's able-bodied, one of the things that I have had to really push back on is like the idea that you're not a real writer if you don't write every day. Because I find that I have stretches of time where I have a lot of energy and I'm really able to focus on something. Usually my book. And then stretches of time where I'm in a lot of pain, I need to sleep, I'm exhausted. So I think that that advice, it's not like immediately incorrect. I wouldn't totally say let's just throw it out because I do think what I had to build is a commitment to the writing and a commitment to the project and saying I do have goals. I'm not going to just let those goals kind of go out the window, but I needed those goals to be flexible in some ways. So if this day I'm not able to write, okay, that's fine because I've built in some extra time on my deadline or things like that. Um, Also getting creative about being able to write like at the doctor's office when I've got 3 appointments in a row and I've already taken off work. Okay, well, I have some time in between those appointments here and there. Let me like put in some words at that time can be useful because for a lot of us writers that are working and sick, your PTO and things like is already going towards your chronic illness. And so you can't necessarily take it to like take a fun writing retreat or something like that. But again, that's not to say like if you need to rest, you should rest because your creative energy will get depleted if you just keep trying to pull at it and pull at it. Um, and then in terms of writing a character with chronic illness, I think that one of the challenges is that I am so familiar with a lot of things about this chronic illness that I might assume that other people already know how it operates and how it feels. And while I think this book in a lot of ways is geared towards other people with chronic illness, we don't all have the same chronic illness. We don't all have the same symptoms. And of course, I am going to have people reading it who don't have chronic illness. So I do want this book to be an avenue for them to also learn. And then also my chronic illness does have to do with the digestive system, so it can get a little yucky. Um, and I definitely didn't shy away from writing that in the book. But what I did struggle with is it can be really repetitive to be somebody who's like, my stomach hurts, or like, I need to use the bathroom. And that needed to be in the book, but not so much that it bogged the emotional tenor of the book down as well. So one of the things that I noticed was that I was focusing so much on that I wasn't always focusing on my main character's relationships with others and what was happening emotionally there. And so I try to balance being aware that a chronic illness colors every part of your life, but also other parts of your life can color a chronic illness.
It's almost a good metaphor for actually experiencing chronic illness, though, at the same time, because from my friends and family members who have suffered with various things, I know that sometimes it can be very difficult when you're having a flare up to just sit there and be like, that is the only thing they can think about, and the rest of the world falls away. And the rest of the
Exactly.
world does move on, but there
Mhm.
are other things to think about. And so I think it's an interesting experience that you had where you're saying, like, you were focusing on this, but there were other things. Plot was happening.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I had a therapist once who told me that you're not defined by your chronic illness, and I can see why that's a valuable thing to say, but I also don't know if I believe it because so much of the way that I move through the world is defined by chronic illness, both negatively and positively. So on the negative side, it's things like needing to be really aware of my energy levels, where bathrooms are, things like that. But then on the positive level, sometimes I feel like in my marriage that I've done the in sickness and health thing with my husband like when I since I've been 25, and so my relationship to love and marriage I think sometimes looks different than some of the people that I know around me, and that can be like a really beautiful thing. Like I think we've seen each other in really vulnerable spaces, so I am really interested in the ways in which there's a way in which chronic illness feeds into your life and then your life feeds right back into chronic illness.
The use of the word vulnerable is particularly interesting because I think just in general, speaking about something that many people often would just say, oh, as you said earlier, that's yucky. I don't want to talk about that. How do
Mm-hmm.
you overcome that vulnerability and actually discuss something that some people might just be like, this is something I'm uncomfortable with?
Mm-hmm. I think that when we write, we do it often to be vulnerable. And I think that when we don't allow ourselves that, we're cutting ourselves off as creatives, but also as people who want to relate to other people. Because a lot of people, and myself included, I think, write because sometimes we don't have the words of how to say these things in real time to people, but we want to communicate these ideas and these stories. So I guess I've never really been afraid of people being like grossed out by my stories or things like that. And maybe this is because the first time I ever wrote a story about my chronic illness, I was like 21 years old. I had just been diagnosed and I brought it to workshop. And the first thing that like someone in the workshop said was like, well, like I tried to open this up in a Starbucks and it was just so gross because the first page has poop on it. And my professor was like, well, I don't think Eshani cares. And I was like, you're right. I don't care because this is my life. And it's annoying to me that you think you can just pass some kind of judgment on that. Um, that being said, I also think that we are not required to say everything on the
Yeah.
page, to share absolutely everything. Um, I think that a useful exercise for people can sometimes be writing down everything that you want to say for yourself and then thinking about, okay, so I've said all of this. What am I actually okay with sharing and what do I want to keep to myself? You don't have to publish everything you write, is something that one of my friends once told me. Um, so I guess that's the start of an answer to your question. I think there's a lot we can talk about with vulnerability.
Oh, absolutely. It's just funny that you mentioned the poop thing because it's actually feedback that I actually got in my book as well, where I had a moment where somebody, the situation was what it was. He needed to go to the bathroom. He had to use a bucket, and one of the comments like, "I don't want to read about someone pooping in a bucket," and I was like, "The situation is so dire. Like there was a reason to
Yeah.
put it in. Like." You're trying to show that this needed to happen, and he's aware of the fact that it
Hmm.
was not ideal,
Hmm.
and that empathy with that character and experiencing both the character's feelings in the situation but also that feeling for the reader is part of the process. It's part of like
Hmm.
what you're engaging with and seeing is that's the emotion we're trying to evoke.
Yeah.
Um,
I think it's okay for people to be grossed out when they're reading something.
yeah,
I think obviously every single person has to figure out their own relationship with things like trigger warnings and that space, but I
yeah.
think that if it's not something that is triggering and more just something that feels a little bit uncomfortable or not something that you're used to reading about, sometimes that can be an opportunity to challenge, why do I think that this should not be in a story?
Um, in fandom cultures, the word is squick, where
Yeah.
you're squicked out by something. It's not a trigger. You can read it. It's just it gives you that feeling, which I feel like the word
Yeah.
actually like tr evokes that feeling. Like it squicks you. You're just it's a bit uncomfortable. Um,
Right. And I want to say, like, it's like, do you think I'm not squicked out by my own grossness sometimes? Like it's a feeling that I also can have about my own body, but I'm trying to show you that through the writing.
yeah, and also to come to terms with it because for many people, they may never have experienced a friend, family member, or personally any type of illness that is prolonged beyond, like
Hmm.
the normal 24-hour bug or whatever.
Hmm.
And they may never have that opportunity until one day they will, because
Yeah.
everybody will eventually either themselves or know somebody who
Hmm.
experiences it. And so fiction can be a very safe way to actually engage with something and be like, oh, here's this thing I never really thought about.
Hmm.
Now you can engage with it before it's actually in your face having to deal with it.
And I think that's the way in which fiction becomes so political in a lot of ways. We read stories of things that we're not necessarily engaging with, and we understand the world in totally different ways, bring empathy in new ways. I think what you said right there is so true. Disability is something that most of us will experience, probably in our own bodies. But maybe in the bodies of others. And I think too that we don't always realize like arthritis is a disability. These things that people just sort of like normalize. Those are all, they're part of the disability community. But it's easier to think about it as something that happens to old people, which I also think is a little odd because do we not have empathy for older people that are also struggling with their bodies? But especially it's something that a lot of people don't realize happens to young people until you start talking about it. Because I talk about it very openly, obviously, in my writing, but also even in my day-to-day life. And once I have started talking about it, tons of people will tell me stories about things that are going on with their health. I think it's just something that we've considered so taboo. And once we make it less taboo, it's actually a pretty large scale experience.
It is. And it's also an experience that people often, as you say, you don't necessarily have to see it. These are all, or there are many invisible disabilities and many invisible illnesses that people go through. Um, I have a friend, for instance, who picture perfect, looks like she's, the pinnacle of health. She's low weight, she's this, she's that, she's gorgeous. But she struggles very much with many different things. And where some people really wish that they could lose weight, she's like, I wish I could gain weight because I
Mhm.
can't put any weight on. And so, like, her experience where she's struggling and she's trying and people don't see that or perceive that because they're like, oh, but you're beautiful. And it kind of goes back to, the theme of your book already, where you're
Mhm.
trying to get this beauty product and beauty in general. You see people trying so hard. They don't want to get older. They want to, hide their wrinkles, hide this. They're so focused on changing themselves from the potential of not perfection but that's
Mhm.
going to happen to everybody at some point.
Yeah, I like to say that this book is not only redefining beauty, but it's also redefining ugliness. So I
Yeah.
hope that when people read it, they start to rethink, why do I think that something is ugly? And what does it mean that I think that thing is ugly?
We always hear these like very trivial comments of beauty's in the eye of the beholder or this or that. But then when you're constantly seeing these are the examples of beauty and anything that's not this is not beautiful and therefore has less value.
Hmm.
Um, how do you deal with when you're writing a story like this, really emphasizing where the value lies and where the characters themselves have shifting value priorities?
It's a journey that these characters have certainly gone on from beginning to end. And they're really interested in how they relate to each other. And I actually think that there's a lot of value in that, but they're sort of going about it the wrong way at the start because they are sort of shrouded in these ideas of, well, okay, well, what does it mean to have like love? And how does that, if I'm beautiful, I will have love and I will feel good and all of these things. And so I think that their values actually, in some ways, remain the same, but the ways in which they understand those values change. So they become more relationally aware as the story goes on.
I'm so fascinated to read this. Like, I know it's coming out in November, but that seems so far away at this point. I'm just like, oh, I want it now. Because it's very timely. Like we have these conversations all the time. And it's something that I think will be very long lasting as a result because these are constant conversations that are always happening, especially with the fluctuations of different cultures and beauty standards. Like we are always having these types of conversations. Um, when you were first drafting this, were there any books or any inspirations that you were seeing elsewhere that were really giving you inspiration for creating the book in the way that you did?
I'm really interested in the growth of the sort of beauty product genre. So we think about Ling Huang's Natural Beauty, Youth Juice by E.K. Sathue, that have come out recently. And there's more books like that. And then also influencer culture. So Aesthetica, that I think is by Allie Rowbottom. Fact check me after the interview on
I'll
that
put it
one.
in a subtitle.
So I think there's a lot happening in this space of beauty and screens and all of that. I read a lot of those books after I had finished some early drafts, and I was reading a little bit more about things that were in the tech industry, and then I was also interested in books that thought about like race and medicine. So I'm thinking Lakewood by Megan Giddings was a book that was really meaningful to me for the writing of this. Um, I find that I read whatever feels exciting to me in that moment, and then it always just feeds back into my writing. And I like reading in that way versus thinking, okay, if I'm writing about makeup, then that's all I need to be reading about, because I think it can be expansive then, to think, okay, so this person wrote this thing about the tech industry. How can that feed back into this book? But I also think it's important to think about what's happening in your own space and own genre. I think that Ling Huang's book, for example, thinks a lot about queerness. My book is not doing that as much. We do have queer characters in my book, but that's chronic illness is kind of the more focus of my novel. Yet both of those books are about characters who are othered in certain ways. And so the idea that we're in conversation, but we're coming at it from different directions is really interesting to me.
I think it's super important whenever doing any type of research to kind of keep that global perspective in mind because everything does relate to something else. So, like as you said, there's the tech industry side, there's beauty focus side, and the ways they can intersect either from a regulation standpoint or from somebody said this thing and that's created an avenue for developing something somewhere else, or even oh, we've decided to have a new marketing practice, and that marketing can now forward here. I mean, there's a lot of intersection between many different areas.
I also just wanted to add that I did a lot of reading also in the contemporary South Asian space, and could definitely have done even more reading in that space. And there's a lot of really exciting things that are happening. Um, because I wanted to think about how this book could be a little bit different than some of the typical South Asian narratives that we saw coming out like in the early 2010s. And I think that now we're seeing a lot of books that are interested in politics. So I'm thinking of Sarah Thankam Mathews, All This Could Be Different, for example. And then also stories of characters that go off to do not the very imperfect things. So I'm thinking of Gold Diggers by Sanjena Sathian. I think that there was a time that we were seeing a very narrow definition of what the South Asian immigrant experience must be. And now there's just so much writing that is happening in so many different ways about the experience of being South Asian. And some of those characters are born here don't, maybe their parents are immigrants, but they're not immigrants themselves. So that changes the calculus for those characters. So I was doing a lot of reading there too.
While you're writing about these different cultural changes, what was something that was particularly important for you to get across? Like what did you really want to focus on for like showing that particular experience?
Um, I was very interested in how the South Asian experience can really operate on a lot of extremes. And so I have the father in the novel is actually really pushes back against being South Asian. He really wants to assimilate, whereas his parents really want him to maintain his cultural identity. And there's a sort of generational trauma of the back and forth and the back and forth of what, what am I supposed to be? And so for these characters, they're trying to reclaim their identity in some capacity while also understanding that they're never going to have the same identity as their grandparents who did actually immigrate from India.
I feel like that's an experience I've actually talked about with some of my friends recently about just their experience as being children of immigrants or being first generation or second generation and how they're struggling to find sense or meaning in where are we, who are we. One of my friends was telling me that she's one of the only people who actually speaks the native language of her family, where her
Mhm.
brother doesn't, and many of her
Mhm.
friends don't. And what that experience is like, where you're trying to find where is my place of belonging and what does
Mhm.
that mean?
Exactly. And I would say you're not necessarily morally better because you have this, cultural marker of I know how to cook the food or something like that than somebody who doesn't. So I don't think it's really a question of that. It's more about that individual understanding of how do I find my comfort place, my community.
Well, yeah, because if there's no moral value judgment on it. I think finding that place and finding the serenity in yourself is the part that most people strive for, and it can be
Mhm.
difficult, especially if you're, am I supposed to be here? Am I supposed to be there? Who am I? Where am I? And then you have the
Mhm.
exterior perspective, especially if you're a person of color and you've immigrated somewhere. Everyone treats you differently. As you said at the very beginning of this interview, you were the only person who happened to look the way you did in a very white community. And what's that like growing up? And then those experiences, which back to the book, wondering about beauty and how you fit in and how you can fit in. So it's very timely and also very emotionally driven, the story that you've written.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm hopeful that people will be able to see their own experiences in this book, and think through how that can kind of manifest in the body as well, which is one of the things that this book is interested in.
We talked a little bit earlier about vulnerability. So much of what we discussed recently in the past few minutes is rooted in vulnerability, vulnerability of trying to find your culture, vulnerability of trying to find your place or comfort in yourself or others. Um, why do you think vulnerability is something that really is a persistent theme throughout your book that you really like honed in on?
Hmm. It's hard to connect to other people if you're not being vulnerable. And these characters are very isolated at the start because of their trauma, which is something that for many people, trauma can do. And in order to reforge connections. They really do have to be vulnerable. Um, at the same time, there's that's mirrored in the illness because there's an isolation to being sick and being pulled away from the rest of society, and then needing to be vulnerable at a doctor's office, vulnerable with other people to explain the fact that you're ill and what does that look like. And there's degrees of that and there's different comfort levels. And so I find that what was happening was that I was writing about a couple different things. Like I was talking about racial trauma, I was talking about chronic illness, I was talking about beauty and the feeling of inferiority in whatever sense. And all of those things did have vulnerability baked into them. And so if I was going to be writing about these strands, I needed to find the thing that pinned them all together. And I think that is in a lot of ways vulnerability.
What would you say the difference is between a character that is vulnerable and a character that is weak?
Mm. I suppose that really is in the eye of the beholder, to go back to your phrase, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Um, I think it's in the eye of the writer, the reader, and the other characters in the novel, because I suppose I'm not sure that I think any character is actually weak. I think that there's a way to say that some characters are not fully realized on the page, and that that could be considered weak from a craft perspective. But I don't think that people, which is what I think of as characters are people, can be considered weak. I think even a character who is crying a lot or sharing, maybe oversharing, that doesn't make them weak. That makes them have a certain coping mechanism or strategy to what they're doing in their space. So I guess that term just never even really crosses my mind.
No, I think it's an important distinction, and it's something I hope readers or listeners, whomever, kind of consider for themselves. I think it's a really good answer. There's a judgment involved when you call somebody weak. There's a
Mhm.
almost a superiority involved when you say, "Oh, well, that person's weak. I'm better than them," or "This person's better than them." However you want to
Mhm.
classify it, there's a insistence there where there's a hierarchy of sorts. But I think many people tend to just be like, oh, that character has issues. They're a weak person, and
Mhm.
how can we define them elsewise? Um, and I think just from hearing you talk about it, for me, the characters you've described don't sound weak. They all sound like they're struggling with a lot of issues that they're dealing with. And I think that's very representative of the human experience, where, as you said, nobody's weak. We're all just dealing with things or coping with things in our own ways. Um, why do you think, or maybe you don't think, why do you think the word weak is often equated with vulnerability, whether it's valid or not?
Mhm. Um, I'm American, so I feel like I can speak maybe to like American culture, being that there's a lot of productivity culture in our society. You dust off, you pick up, you keep moving forward, for better or really probably for worse. There's a lot of bootstrap mentality. And that is really part of the way that we interact with other people. I think that we feel really uncomfortable when other people say, well, I need to rest, or like, this is what's going on with me. I mean, even the idea when someone asks, like, how are you? You're not supposed to say that you're not well,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
And I think it really sometimes freaks people out when I will be like, oh yeah, my chronic illness is flaring. And it's like, I just wanted to hear you say good. That's all, like, that's all I wanted you to say. Um, and so I think it's easy to label people as weak. I think that there also might be a desire sometimes for other people to be able to be as vulnerable as the person that they're talking to, but because they might not be able to do that themselves, it might be easier to say, well, that's a weak way of being, and I'm strong. And I think that we're all strong because we're showing up and we're doing the things that get us through life, but it's not stronger to create distance, I think, and create less opportunities for connection.
No, absolutely. I think you really just hit the nail on the head. It's just this constant push of gotta get it done over and over and over again. Fill up your schedule, and then you can be proud of yourself because your schedule was
Mhm.
filled. But that doesn't really mean that you've, created those connections, that you've really like been aware of what's happening around you, or even aware of what's happening in your own body, because you're just
Yeah.
lots of people
hmm
going into burnout.
Yeah. I think that it's also really easy to call disabled people and chronically ill people weak. That's something that comes up a lot. And I would argue that while I don't actually believe that anybody is like stronger than another person, I think again, we're all strong in our own way. It's really hard for me to show up to work, 35 hours a week at my office and takes a lot of energy and takes a lot of planning for me. And so it's actually brave for me to be doing that.
Well, I mean, I think a good way for some people to maybe to think about it, and please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, is the effort to do the task is so much harder when you're struggling with chronic illness, some sort of disability, anything of that nature. And the amount of effort is like if you show up to work and you've got, 400 pounds on you and you're dragging it forward and you're still going there, you're doing your 35 hours, you're doing the very best that you can. And then somebody else who doesn't have the 400-pound weight that they're dragging with them, they can just zip in and zip out. The amount of actual effort involved is so much more for the person who's experiencing chronic illness, disability, maybe a disease of some sort, than it is for the person who's just like, I'm good, and has all that
Mhm.
energy to like go to the gym after work and do this and do that and have a full schedule afterwards.
Right. And so if the disabled person needs to rest, that's not an inherently weak thing. And I would also say it's important to remember that just because that other person is able-bodied doesn't mean that they're also not bringing in weight from some other part of their life.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think it's just, it's important for us to recognize that our struggles are our struggles and other people also, of course, have struggles.
Absolutely. Like I said earlier, there's a lot of invisibility in both chronic illness, mental, family struggles, everything else. And because of that grinding culture where you have to show up, you have to do the work, you have to do this, you don't really necessarily know what is that other person processing. What, like maybe they're angry or crying or yelling, and you don't know what's going on in their life because they've got so much going on that you don't get to see because all you get is that moment.
Exactly. Exactly.
Um, when you finished writing the book, or let's go back a little bit. Why did you decide I want to write this book? I want to write about chronic illness. I want to write it in this way, and I actually want to make it a book and publish it. Like, what was that triggering thought that you had that this was a book you were going to write?
Hmm. So I've always wanted to write books. I know every author says that. But ever since I was a little kid, I've been like, I'm gonna write a book, I'm gonna write a book. But I think the question of what made it this book is interesting. And I'm sort of thinking on the spot here.
Sorry, it wasn't
Um,
my pre-planned question, so
no, no, no. It's more just it's no, it's interesting to me that you ask that. I guess probably that it brought together so many of my life experiences. It feels like a book that is very much the culmination of the first 3 decades of my life. And it's interesting leaving that. Like, it's interesting now it's going out into the world and thinking about new projects because those projects don't seem like the culmination of 3 decades. They seem like maybe I'll be writing some things that started off like in my mid 20s and then are continuing into my 30s. So maybe I can broadly say that there are books that speak to these large swaths of your life, and questions that maybe you've been asking for a while. And when you hit on a book topic, an idea that can open the doors for you to ask those questions on the page, those are the books that you're probably going to actually end up writing.
yeah, I can relate to that. Absolutely. Um, once you had the book in hand, What was your querying process like? I remember I was speaking with another author earlier this week, where we talked about how on querying websites, uh, they sometimes have questions. Do you want to self-identify as whatever in order to let the agent know? Was that something you felt comfortable discussing? Were you like, I don't want to do that. I just want the book to stand on its merit. How did that process work for you?
I spoke to it pretty much in the query letter. I wrote that I was chronically ill. I wanted agents to be aware that this was a book that was coming from somebody who was chronically ill. And I also wanted them to be aware that in working with me, we might have to be flexible in certain ways. And that was a question that I asked when I had offer calls as well. Just how would you manage, what if I am in the hospital for a week and we're kind of on deadline? How will we manage that and work around that? And I did find that most agents had really great answers for that. But I think it's something that's always important to ask, because the relationship is an intimate one in a lot of ways with your agent. I think it's a professional working one, and at the same time, it is one in which that person really has to be able to have your back, in an industry where a lot of things are happening at once. And I got really lucky in the sense that I actually have two agents. And so my two agents both really loved the chronic illness part of the book. And that was why I wanted to go with them as well. They weren't asking me to write in a different direction.
I have to ask because it is a little bit unusual. How did you end up with two agents?
Yeah, it's a fun story. In that I queried pretty widely, and then got a couple offers. I was lucky in that way, and had these calls. And my one agent told me that she was moving agencies, but didn't say where. And I kind of said, well, okay, I'm sort of curious because I have a couple more just like offers out there. And she explained that she was moving to the agency that was probably like in my top three that I wanted to work with, and she was in my top three. And I was like, okay, I'm gonna go for the, stars here and be like, what if you both want the book, you both get me. And she said, okay, let me ask. And so my agency Trellis actually does do a lot of dual agenting, and I think it works out really nicely because you get a couple different perspectives on the book while you're working on it, and also a nice the workload kind of isn't as heavy, I think, for the agent. And if one of them needs to be out of office or things like that, they can kind of balance that. So far, it's been really lovely.
Fantastic. I'm so happy for you. And it sounds like it was a great arrangement for you. And that sounds
Yeah.
great. Um, You mentioned that you did say it in your cover letter that you had a chronic illness. What would you suggest to maybe other writers who are handling a chronic illness, a disease, or some sort of whatever in their life of how they should bring something like that up to their agent, whether it's something that happens after they've gotten an agent or even as you did in your query letter before the
Mhm.
process starts?
I think it depends, if you're asking sort of is the book predominantly about chronic illness, or is it more a question of this is something that is a part of my life and I just, I want you to be aware of it. I think if the book is about chronic illness, I don't think anyone is required to self-identify, but I think it can be useful for the agent to be aware of that, particularly because there can be biases like, oh, this isn't how it is, because in their own mind, they may have some particular relationship with an illness or a disease. Again, I don't think it's a requirement to self-identify, but it's a way also of owning the story. Um, if it's more a question about the working relationship. Ultimately, it's certainly up to each writer. I, in my life, am generally quite open about my chronic illness. I even talk about it in my day job workplace, and have been lucky to find support for that. Not everybody, of course, is going to experience that, unfortunately. Um, but the agenting process can also look different for each person. So if you're somebody who has a couple of offers, then perhaps it's something that you want to bring up and see which agent has the best answer to how will I support you. If you only have one offer and you're afraid to disclose that for some reason, A, I would maybe think about then is that the right relationship for a person who's supposed to be an advocate for you? But B, okay, maybe you move forward without disclosing that and then see how the relationship opens up and it unfolds. And if at no point it seems like this person is able to support you in your illness, it's always possible to change agents. There's a lot of agents out there.
That's it for this week's episode of Lindsey Byrd in Writing is Hard. Eshani Surya's book, Ravishing, is out on the 11th of November, 2025. Check out the description to find out more about her and where to find her book. If you enjoyed this content, please do like, share, and subscribe so we can continue to make you more. Bye for now.